Good evening, friends. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we begin, let me invite you to get truly comfortable. Dim your lights, or turn them off completely if you'd like. Rest your head on your pillow, adjust your blankets just the way you love them, and let your body sink into the softness beneath you. Tonight, we're going to drift together into the distant world of the Middle Ages, a time of castles and candlelight, of troubadours strumming lutes in shadowy corridors, and of a peculiar kind of love that was both celebrated and forbidden. We'll explore courtly love and adultery, not with scandal or excitement, but with the gentle, meandering pace of a story told by firelight. If this calm journey helps you unwind, and if it feels right to you, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe to the channel. No pressure, of course, only if it brings you peace. Now, let your breathing slow, let your eyelids grow heavy, and let me carry you back in time, to a world where love was a game, a poem, a secret whispered in stone hallways. Let me tell you about a peculiar kind of love that began to bloom in the courts of medieval Europe, somewhere around the 12th century. Picture this. It's a cold evening in the year 1170, and you're sitting in a grand hall in the south of France, in a region called Aquitaine. The stone walls around you are thick and ancient, hung with tapestries that sway gently whenever someone opens a door. Candles flicker in iron sconces, casting shadows that dance like spirits along the floor. The air smells of wood smoke and roasted meat, and somewhere in the corner, a musician plucks a lute, the notes soft and melancholic. This is the world of courtly love, a tradition that would define romance for centuries to come. But here's the twist, the thing that makes it so strange and fascinating. Courtly love was almost always about desiring someone you couldn't have. Most often, a knight would fall hopelessly, dramatically, poetically in love with a lady who was already married, usually to his lord, the very man he'd sworn to serve. Wild, isn't it? Now, you might wonder how this became acceptable, even celebrated. Well, let me walk you through it gently, like we're strolling through a moonlit garden. Courtly love wasn't about marriage. In fact, marriage in the Middle Ages was often a business transaction. Noble families arranged marriages to consolidate land, forge alliances, and produce heirs. Love, as we think of it today, was almost beside the point. A noblewoman might marry at 14 to a man twice her age whom she'd met once, maybe twice. Romance? That was something else entirely. And so, the idea of courtly love emerged as a kind of antidote. It was a game, a performance, a way to express longing and devotion in a world where such feelings had no official place. Knights would worship their chosen lady from afar, writing poems about her beauty, performing brave deeds in her honor, and generally acting like lovesick puppies. The lady, in turn, would remain distant, unattainable, perfect, a living symbol of virtue and grace. Imagine the sort of poems they wrote. A knight might compare his lady's eyes to stars, her lips to rose petals, her voice to the song of angels. He'd say things like, "My heart is a captive in the prison of your beauty," or, "I would cross 1,000 battlefields just to glimpse your smile." It sounds almost comical to us now, doesn't it? But back then, this was the height of sophistication. Let me give you a small, cozy detail to anchor this moment in time. In the courts where courtly love flourished, they often served a treat called dragis, sugared almonds, coated in honey and spices. These little sweets were luxury items, expensive and rare, and they were often given as tokens of affection. Imagine a knight, after performing a song in honor of his lady, receiving a single dragée from her hand wrapped in a scrap of silk. He'd treasure it like a holy relic, perhaps keeping it in a pouch close to his heart. The sweetness of that almond, the faint taste of cinnamon and honey, would linger on his tongue as he lay awake at night, composing yet another poem about his impossible love. Now, you might be thinking, wasn't this just adultery with extra steps? And what if? That's exactly what it often became. The line between poetic admiration and physical affair was thinner than a whisper, and many courtly romances crossed it. But here's where it gets interesting. The culture of courtly love had rules, written down by poets and philosophers as if they were laws. One of the most famous was penned by a man named Andreas Capellanus around 1180, in a book called The Art of Courtly Love. He laid out 31 rules for lovers, and they're equal parts charming and absurd. For instance, rule number 1, marriage is no real excuse for not loving. In other words, the fact that your beloved is married to someone else is irrelevant. Rule 13, love is always a stranger to avarice, meaning true lovers shouldn't be motivated by greed. And Rule 15, every lover regularly turns pale in the presence of his beloved. Imagine that. You're supposed to go physically pale, as if the mere sight of the person you love drains the blood from your face. Dramatic, isn't it? But here's the cozy, human part of all this. Beneath the poetry and the rules, these were real people navigating real emotions. A young knight stationed at a lord's castle, far from his own home, might genuinely fall for the lord's wife. She, trapped in a loveless marriage, might find solace in his attention. They'd exchange glances across the dinner table, pass notes through trusted servants, meet in the garden at dusk when the light was soft and forgiving. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was also one of the few ways people in that rigid, hierarchical world could feel something real. Let me paint you another scene to help you drift deeper. It's late autumn, and the castle courtyard is covered in fallen leaves, all gold and crimson and brown. A lady stands by a stone fountain, her long gown trailing in the grass, her breath misting in the chilly air. A knight approaches, his cloak pulled tight against the wind. He hands her a small parcel. Inside, a piece of marchpane, that sweet almond paste confection that was so popular in medieval feasts. She smiles, just slightly, and tucks it into her sleeve. No words are exchanged. They don't need to be. In that moment, the gift says everything. I see you, I think of you, I long for you. This was courtly love. A dance of symbols and gestures, of longing that was never fully satisfied. And in a way, that's what made it so powerful. The unattainability was the point. Desire that could never be completely fulfilled burned brighter, lasted longer, inspired greater devotion, or so the poets claimed. Of course, not everyone bought into this ideal. Some medieval writers mocked courtly love as silly and impractical. Others saw it as genuinely dangerous, a threat to the social order. And they weren't entirely wrong. When love and loyalty were supposed to flow in strict, predictable channels, from vassal to lord, from wife to husband, any romantic entanglement that defied those channels was, by definition, subversive. But for now, let's leave the grand debates to the scholars. Let's just sit here by this imaginary fire, listening to the soft crackle of burning logs, and picture those medieval lovers with their impossible dreams, their secret notes, their sugared almonds wrapped in silk. Let your mind drift into that world, where every glance carried meaning, every word was poetry, and love was always just out of reach. And now, let your mind drift to the courts of southern France, where the rules of love were not just written, they were performed, judged, and sometimes punished. Imagine, if you will, a grand chamber in a castle in Poitiers, France. The year is around 1170, and the room is filled with noblewomen in flowing gowns, their hair hidden beneath delicate veils, their faces lit by the soft glow of afternoon sunlight streaming through narrow windows. At the center of this gathering sits Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and fascinating women of the Middle Ages. She's in her late 40s, a queen twice over, first of France, then of England, and she's about to preside over something utterly unique, a court of love. Yes, you heard that right, a court of love. Not a court of law, though it borrowed some of the same formality. This was a gathering where questions of romance, desire, and courtly etiquette were debated and judged like legal cases. Should a knight be allowed to love two ladies at once? If a lady rejects a suitor, must she give him a reason? Can true love exist within marriage, or is it only found outside it? These were the kinds of questions brought before Eleanor and her circle of noble ladies, and they took them seriously, offering rulings that were sometimes playful, sometimes profound, and always fascinating. Let me set the scene a bit more. The stone floor is covered with woven rushes mixed with dried lavender, so every step releases a faint, calming fragrance. Servants move quietly along the edges of the room, offering cups of spiced wine, warm, fragrant, tasting of cloves and cinnamon, a little like mulled cider but richer, heavier. The noblewomen sit in high-backed chairs, their expressions thoughtful as they listen to a young troubadour present a case. He's asking whether a knight who's devoted himself to a lady for 7 years without reward should give up or persevere. The room buzzes with quiet discussion. Some ladies argue for perseverance. True love, after all, is patient. Others suggest the knight redirect his affections to someone more responsive. Eleanor listens, one elegant hand resting on the arm of her chair, a slight smile playing at her lips. Finally, she delivers her verdict. The knight should persevere, for love without suffering is not love at all. Dramatic? Absolutely. But also strangely comforting. These courts gave structure to emotions that otherwise felt chaotic and overwhelming. They turned love into a kind of art form, something that could be studied, refined, debated. And at the heart of it all were women, powerful, educated women who used these gatherings to exercise a kind of authority they rarely had elsewhere. Eleanor of Aquitaine is a perfect example. Born in 1122, she inherited the vast duchy of Aquitaine when she was just 15, making her the most eligible heiress in Europe. She married Louis VII of France, but their marriage was rocky, and she eventually secured an annulment. Then, in a move that scandalized Europe, she married Henry II of England just 2 months later, bringing Aquitaine with her and shifting the balance of power in the region. She was brilliant, headstrong, and utterly uninterested in being a passive queen. When she held court in Poitiers in her later years, surrounded by poets and musicians and noblewomen, she created a space where the rules of love and courtship could be explored in ways that gave women a rare voice. Now, let me tell you about a food that might have been served at one of these gatherings, just to keep us grounded in the sensory details. Imagine a platter of pâté de fruits, fruit pastes made from quince, apple, or pear, cooked down with honey and spices until they became thick, jewel-like slices. They were often cut into shapes, sometimes flowers or stars, and dusted with a bit of sugar. They'd be sticky, sweet, with a subtle tartness underneath, and they'd melt on your tongue like candy. Eleanor might have nibbled on one absently as she listened to a troubadour's petition, her mind already forming her response. But here's where the story takes a turn, a gentle twist. The courts of love, as romantic and sophisticated as they sound, were also deeply intertwined with the reality of adultery. Because for all the high-minded talk of noble devotion and virtuous longing, many courtly love affairs were, quite simply, extramarital relationships. And while the culture celebrated the longing, the secrecy, the poetry, the consequences for those caught could be severe. Consider this. A noblewoman accused of adultery could lose everything, her reputation, her property, even her life in extreme cases. A knight involved in such an affair might face exile, imprisonment, or death, depending on the power and temperament of the offended husband. And yet, the very culture that punished adultery also romanticized it. It's one of those fascinating contradictions that makes history feel so human, so real. People knew the rules, knew the risks, and still they took them. Let me tell you a gentler story, one that captures this tension. In the late 12th century, there was a lady, let's call her Isabel, though her real name is lost to time, who lived in a castle in Provence. She was married to an older lord, a man respected but not particularly affectionate. A young knight in her husband's service fell deeply in love with her. He wrote her poems, performed brave deeds in tournaments wearing her colors, and slowly, carefully, she began to return his feelings. They never acted on them, or so the story goes. Instead, they maintained a relationship of pure longing, exchanging letters, meeting in the garden to talk, always keeping just on the acceptable side of propriety. When the knight was called away to join a crusade, he left Isabel a gift. A small wooden box containing a piece of spiced honey cake wrapped in linen. She kept it for years, never eating it, a symbol of the love that existed but could never be fully realized. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? And also oddly beautiful. This is the world of courtly love, full of passion, but also restraint, full of desire, but also discipline. The courts of love tried to give shape to all of this, to create a framework where emotions could be expressed, admired, even judged, without necessarily destroying lives. But not all stories ended so gently. Some courtly romances exploded into scandal. Some ended in heartbreak, exile, or worse. And in the next whisper of our story, we'll drift into those darker, more dangerous waters. But for now, let yourself rest in this moment, in this imaginary hall in Poitiers. Imagine Eleanor's calm, knowing smile. Imagine the taste of fruit paste on your tongue, the scent of lavender underfoot, the soft murmur of noblewomen debating the mysteries of the heart. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts grow quiet. And let your mind drift to the stories hidden in castle walls, the secrets passed between lovers in the dim glow of twilight. Now, let me take you back a little further in time, to the early 12th century, to the city of Paris. The year is around 1115, and the air is filled with the sound of church bells and the chatter of scholars. Paris is becoming a center of learning, a place where great minds gather to debate philosophy and theology. And at the heart of this intellectual ferment is a man named Peter Abelard, a brilliant philosopher and teacher whose fame has spread across Europe. Abelard is in his 30s, tall and striking, with a sharp wit and a sharper tongue. He's known for dismantling his opponents in debates, for his dazzling lectures, and for his absolute confidence in his own intellect. Students flock to hear him speak, cramming into halls and courtyards, hanging on his every word. But despite his brilliance, Abelard is also arrogant, dismissive of rivals, and utterly unprepared for what's about to happen to him. He's about to fall in love. Her name is Heloise. She's 17, maybe 18, and already renowned for her learning, an extraordinary thing for a woman in that era. She reads Latin and Greek, studies scripture and philosophy, and lives with her uncle, a canon named Fulbert, in a house near the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Fulbert is immensely proud of his niece's intellect and eager for her to learn from the best. So he arranges for Abelard to become her private tutor. Can you see where this is going? Let me set the scene for you, softly, gently. Imagine a small room in Fulbert's house, lit by a single candle. Heloise sits at a wooden table, a manuscript open before her, her brow furrowed in concentration. Abelard stands nearby, pointing out a passage, his voice low and serious. At first, their lessons are exactly what they're supposed to be, discussions of philosophy, theology, the structure of logical arguments. But slowly, imperceptibly, something shifts. A shared glance lingers a moment too long. Abelard's hand brushes Heloise as he reaches for a page. They begin to talk about things beyond their studies, their dreams, their fears, their loneliness. It doesn't take long before they fall into a passionate affair. Medieval chroniclers would later describe it in the language of courtly love, but this was something raw, more real. They weren't playing a game of distant admiration. They were fully, recklessly in love, and they hid their relationship as best they could, meeting in secret, stealing hours together whenever Fulbert was away. Here's a small, tender detail to anchor this moment. In Paris at that time, street vendors sold warm ublis, thin, crisp wafers cooked on hot irons and sometimes sweetened with honey. Abelard might have bought one for Heloise on a winter afternoon, and they'd break it in half, sharing it as they walked along the narrow, muddy streets of the city, their breath misting in the cold air. It's the kind of simple human moment that makes history feel close, real. But of course, secrets like this rarely stay hidden for long. Heloise became pregnant. In desperation, Abelard arranged for her to leave Paris quietly and stay with his family in Brittany, where she gave birth to a son. They named him Astrolabe after the astronomical instrument, a name that tells you something about the kind of people they were, intellectuals even in crisis. Abelard wanted to do the right thing. He proposed marriage, hoping it would appease Fulbert and restore Heloise's honor. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn. Heloise refused. She argued, passionately and eloquently, that marriage would ruin Abelard's career. As a teacher and philosopher associated with the church, he was expected to remain celibate. A wife would make him a scandal, a laughingstock. She told him she'd rather be his mistress than his wife, that she loved him too much to let him sacrifice everything for her. It's one of the most extraordinary moments in medieval history. A woman arguing against her own marriage, prioritizing her lover's ambitions over her own security. Eventually, Abelard convinced her, and they married in secret. But the damage was done. Fulbert, humiliated and enraged, wanted revenge. And he got it. One night, Fulbert hired men to break into Abelard's lodgings. They held him down and castrated him. A brutal, horrifying act meant to destroy him both physically and socially. Abelard survived, but he was shattered. He retreated to a monastery, becoming a monk, and Heloise, heartbroken, took vows and became a nun. You'd think the story ends there, in tragedy and silence. But it doesn't. Years later, Abelard and Heloise began to exchange letters, and these letters, preserved and cherished across centuries, are some of the most moving documents of medieval love. Heloise wrote with raw honesty about her enduring passion, about how even in the convent, she couldn't stop thinking of him, longing for him. Abelard's replies were more measured, more philosophical, urging her to find peace in God. But beneath his careful words, you can sense the echo of what they'd lost. Let me read you a sense of what Heloise wrote, in spirit if not exact words. Even now, in the silence of the cloister, I see your face. I remember the warmth of your hand, the sound of your voice. They call this life holy, but I feel only absence. It's devastating, isn't it? And yet there's something almost comforting in the honesty of it. The way she refuses to pretend her feelings have disappeared just because she's taken vows. Imagine, for a moment, Heloise sitting in her convent cell, a small, cold room with a narrow window. She's writing by candlelight, her hand moving slowly across the parchment. On a nearby table sits a simple meal, a piece of dark bread, a little cheese, and perhaps a baked apple, soft and fragrant with cinnamon. She takes a bite absently, her mind elsewhere, lost in memories of a life that feels impossibly far away. Abelard and Heloise spent the rest of their lives apart, but when they died, they were buried together, side by side. Their tomb still exists in Paris, in the Père Lachaise cemetery, and even today, lovers leave notes and flowers there, as if seeking a blessing from two people who loved desperately and lost everything. This is one of the most famous stories of courtly love and adultery in the Middle Ages, but it's also a reminder that these weren't just abstract concepts. They were real people with real pain and real devotion. And as we drift forward in time, we'll meet more of them, knights and ladies, poets and lovers, all caught in the strange, beautiful, dangerous dance of courtly love. Let your eyelids grow heavier now. Let the story settle around you like a soft blanket. Picture that candlelit room, that quiet convent, that love that endured across distance and time. Let me take you now into the realm of legend, where history and myth blur together like watercolors bleeding into each other on damp parchment. We're going to talk about the most famous courtly love affair of the Middle Ages, one so powerful, so enduring, that it's been told and retold for over 800 years. I'm talking, of course, about Lancelot and Guinevere. Now, you might be thinking, wait, aren't they fictional? And yes, you're right, they are characters from the legends of King Arthur. But here's the thing. Fiction tells us truths about the cultures that create it. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere, as it was shaped and popularized in the 12th century, is a perfect mirror of the ideals and anxieties of courtly love. It's a story about the knight who serves his king with absolute loyalty and yet falls hopelessly in love with the king's wife. It's about devotion and betrayal, honor and desire, and the impossible choices people make when their hearts pull them in two directions at once. The story comes to us most vividly through a poet named Chrétien de Troyes, who was writing in the 1170s in the court of, you guessed it, Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, Marie de Champagne. Chrétien wrote a romance called The Knight of the Cart, and it's here that Lancelot truly comes to life. Let me paint the scene for you, slowly, so you can sink into it. It's early morning in Camelot, the legendary castle of King Arthur. The air is cool and misty, and the stone halls are quiet except for the soft footsteps of servants lighting fires and preparing breakfast. In the great hall, Guinevere sits at the high table, her golden hair covered by a delicate veil, her hands folded in her lap. She's King Arthur's queen, admired by all for her beauty and grace. And yet, if you look closely, you might see a flicker of sadness in her eyes, a sense of something missing. Enter Lancelot, the greatest knight in the kingdom. He's brave, skilled with a sword, utterly devoted to Arthur. But the moment he sees Guinevere, something shifts in him. It's not a sudden, explosive thing. It's quieter than that. It's like a door opening inside him, letting in a light he didn't know he'd been missing. From that moment, Lancelot is hers, completely, irrevocably. And Guinevere, lonely in her gilded role as queen, finds herself drawn to him in return. Their love is the epitome of courtly romance. Lancelot performs impossible deeds in Guinevere's honor. In one famous episode, he fights in a tournament and, at Guinevere's request, deliberately fights poorly to prove his devotion to her will over his own pride. In another, he crosses a bridge made of a sword blade, cutting his hands and feet, enduring agony, all to rescue her from captivity. The pain doesn't matter. The humiliation doesn't matter. Only she matters. But here's where the story gets complicated, where it stops being a simple tale of noble love and becomes something darker, more human. Lancelot and Guinevere don't just admire each other from afar. They have an affair. They betray Arthur, the king who trusts them both. And this betrayal, according to the legends, is part of what eventually brings down Camelot, shattering the fellowship of the Round Table and plunging the kingdom into chaos. Think about that for a moment. The greatest love story in Arthurian legend is also the story of the kingdom's downfall. It's tragic, deeply so, but it's also a perfect reflection of the tensions within courtly love culture. The same qualities that make Lancelot a great lover, his absolute devotion, his willingness to sacrifice everything for Guinevere, also make him a traitor to his king and his closest friend. Let me give you a small, sensory detail to help you rest into this moment. Imagine a feast in Camelot's great hall. The long tables are covered with food, roasted venison, loaves of bread still warm from the oven, dishes of stewed plums spiced with ginger. And there, at the center of the table, is a subtlety, a decorative dish made from marchpane and sugar, shaped into a castle with tiny towers and banners. It's a work of art, almost too beautiful to eat. Guinevere might glance at it, then across the hall to where Lancelot sits, and their eyes would meet for just a heartbeat before she looks away. In that glance, everything is said. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere was wildly popular in the Middle Ages, told and retold by troubadours and poets across Europe. Because it captured something essential about the courtly love ideal, the beauty of longing, the tragedy of impossible devotion, the way love could be both ennobling and destructive. It gave people a way to explore their own desires and conflicts through the safe distance of legend. But it's worth remembering that these stories didn't exist in a vacuum. They were told in courts where real affairs were happening, where real noblewomen and knights navigated the same treacherous waters. A knight listening to the tale of Lancelot might see himself in it, might feel both inspired and warned. A noblewoman might hear Guinevere's story and recognize her own loneliness, her own longing for something more than the political marriage she's trapped in. And here's a surprising little historical detail. In some versions of the Arthurian legends, Guinevere isn't just a passive object of desire. She's complex, flawed, sometimes even manipulative. She uses her power as queen, tests Lancelot's devotion, makes demands. She's not a perfect lady on a pedestal. She's a human being trying to find agency in a world that gives her very little. That complexity is part of what makes the story endure. It feels real, even wrapped in the language of myth. Now, let your mind drift deeper into that imaginary hall. Picture the firelight flickering on stone walls, the sound of a lute playing softly in the background, the taste of spiced plums on your tongue. Imagine Lancelot and Guinevere, locked in a love that's both beautiful and doomed, knowing that every stolen moment brings them closer to disaster, and yet unable to stop. Let your breathing slow. Let the story wash over you like a gentle tide. And let your mind drift to the courts and castles where these tales were told, where love was poetry, and poetry was life. Now, let me take you to a quieter, more somber place. We've talked about the poetry and passion of courtly love, the grand romances, and the tragic affairs. But we haven't yet talked about the elephant in the room, the church. Because while poets and nobles were celebrating love affairs and writing rules for secret romances, the church was watching, and it was not amused. Imagine a cold stone chapel somewhere in the French countryside, in the year 1200. The walls are bare, the floor is dirt, and a single small window lets in a shaft of weak winter sunlight. A priest stands at the front, his voice echoing slightly as he delivers a sermon on the sin of adultery. His words are harsh, uncompromising. Adultery is a mortal sin, one that endangers the soul and threatens the very fabric of Christian society. Those who commit it risk eternal damnation, burning in the fires of hell unless they repent. Now, picture a noblewoman sitting in the congregation, her head bowed, her hands folded. She's wearing a heavy woolen cloak against the cold, and beneath it, hidden close to her heart, is a letter from a knight who loves her, a knight who is not her husband. She listens to the priest's words, and she feels a stab of fear, of guilt. But she also feels the warmth of that letter against her skin, and she knows she'll read it again tonight, in the privacy of her chamber, by candlelight. This is the tension that ran through medieval society like a fault line. On one side, the church preached strict sexual morality. Marriage was a sacrament, a holy bond that couldn't be broken. Sex outside marriage was sin, plain and simple. Adultery was one of the gravest offenses, right up there with murder and heresy. And yet, on the other side, the culture of courtly love celebrated precisely the kind of relationships the church condemned. How did people reconcile this? The answer is, not easily. Let me tell you about confession and penance, because that's where a lot of this played out. In the medieval Catholic Church, confession was a powerful tool. If you sinned, you could confess to a priest, express genuine repentance, and receive penance, usually prayers, fasting, or charitable acts that would cleanse your soul. For noblewomen and knights involved in adulterous affairs, confession became a kind of safety valve, a way to acknowledge their sin without necessarily ending the relationship that caused it. Imagine our noblewoman again. She goes to confession, kneeling in the dim corner of the chapel, speaking through a wooden screen to the priest. She confesses her feelings for the night, perhaps even admits to stolen kisses or secret meetings. The priest assigns her penance, say, 20 Hail Marys and a day of fasting. She performs the penance dutifully, her soul theoretically cleansed. And then, a week later, she meets the knight again in the garden, and the cycle begins anew. It sounds hypocritical, doesn't it? But it's also deeply human. People have always found ways to negotiate between the ideals they're supposed to live by and the messy reality of their desires. The church knew this too. Some priests were strict and unforgiving, but others were more understanding, more willing to see sin as part of the human condition rather than a mark of irredeemable evil. Here's a cozy little detail to ground us. In many medieval monasteries and churches, there were kitchens where simple, humble meals were prepared. One common dish was porridge, made from oats or barley, cooked slowly over a low fire until it was thick and creamy. Sometimes it was sweetened with a bit of honey or flavored with dried fruit. Imagine a monk sitting at a rough wooden table, eating a bowl of this porridge, still warm, as he contemplates a manuscript about sin and redemption. The porridge is plain, but comforting, grounding. It's the taste of simplicity, of the everyday rhythm of religious life, so different from the grand passions of the courtly world. But the church didn't just preach, it also tried to regulate. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council made annual confession mandatory for all Christians. This meant that everyone, from peasants to kings, was supposed to confess their sins at least once a year. For those involved in courtly love affairs, this created a complicated annual ritual. You'd have to face your sins, articulate them, and at least pretend to repent. Some people took it seriously. Others went through the motions. And some, no doubt, confessed only the mildest version of their transgressions, leaving out the most damning details. There were also punishments for adultery that went beyond the spiritual. If an affair was discovered and became a public scandal, the consequences could be severe. A noblewoman might be sent to a convent, essentially imprisoned for the rest of her life. A knight might be stripped of his lands and titles, exiled, or even executed, depending on the status of the cuckolded husband. The church might impose public penance. Imagine having to walk through your village wearing a sign that proclaimed your sin, while neighbors whispered and pointed. And yet, despite all this, courtly love persisted. Because it offered something that neither marriage nor the church could fully provide: a space for individual desire, for emotional connection, for the idea that love, real, passionate, all-consuming love, mattered. It was a form of quiet rebellion, a way of asserting that the human heart couldn't be entirely controlled by laws and doctrines. Let me tell you one more small story, a gentler one. There was a knight in 13th century Germany who fell in love with a lady, as knights did. But this knight was also deeply religious, tormented by guilt over his feelings. He wrote a series of poems, part love song, part prayer, in which he begged God to free him from his desire, or else to sanctify it somehow, to make it holy. It's a beautiful, heartbreaking paradox. He wanted to love her and to love God, and he couldn't figure out how to do both. In the end, according to the story, he never acted on his love. He served the lady from a distance, wrote his poems, and eventually joined a monastery where he spent the rest of his life in prayer. Some might see that as a tragedy, a life unlived. Others might see it as a triumph of faith over temptation. But what I see is someone trying, with everything he had, to navigate an impossible situation, to honor both his heart and his soul. Let your mind rest on that image for a moment. A monk in a quiet cell, candlelight flickering, a bowl of porridge cooling on the table. Outside, the world goes on with its passions and its sins, its poems and its secrets. But here, in this small space, there's peace, or at least the hope of it. Let your breathing deepen. Let your thoughts slow and soften. And let your mind drift to the final chapter of our story, where we'll see how courtly love, for all its beauty and danger, eventually began to fade. Let me bring you forward now, gently, slowly, to the later Middle Ages, the 14th and 15th centuries. The world is changing. The age of chivalry is beginning to wane. The grand castles and noble courts where courtly love flourished are still there, but they feel different now, less certain, less magical. The Black Death has swept through Europe, killing a third of the population, and in its wake, people are questioning everything: their faith, their social structures, their ideals of love and honor. Picture a castle in the year 1380, somewhere in England. The hall is the same as it was 2 centuries ago: stone walls, tapestries, a fire crackling in the hearth, but the mood has shifted. The troubadours are fewer now, and their songs sound quaint, almost old-fashioned. Knights still wear armor and fight in tournaments, but increasingly warfare is changing. Longbows and gunpowder are making the armored knight less dominant on the battlefield. And the old rituals of courtly love, the elaborate games of longing and devotion, are starting to feel like relics of a bygone era. But even as courtly love fades, its influence lingers. It's woven into the fabric of Western culture in ways that are still visible today. The idea that romantic love should be passionate, that it should involve longing and devotion, that it's somehow ennobling and worth sacrificing for. All of this comes, in large part, from the medieval tradition of courtly love. So do many of our tropes about romance. Love at first sight, the idea of the soulmate, the notion that true love overcomes all obstacles. These aren't universal human beliefs, they're cultural constructs, and they were born in the courts and castles of medieval Europe. Let me tell you about one of the last great flowerings of courtly love literature, the story of Tristan and Isolde. It's an older legend, but it was retold over and over in the late Middle Ages, and it captures both the beauty and the tragedy of the courtly love ideal. Tristan is a knight sent to escort Isolde, a princess, back to his uncle King Mark, who plans to marry her. But on the journey, Tristan and Isolde accidentally drink a love potion, and they fall desperately, irrevocably in love. The potion is magic, but it's also a metaphor, love as something beyond control, a force that sweeps you away whether you want it to or not. Tristan and Isolde begin an affair, even after Isolde marries King Mark. They meet in secret, suffer through separations, endure endless guilt and fear. And in the end, depending on the version, they both die, sometimes in each other's arms, sometimes apart but thinking of each other. It's a story that asks, is love worth this much suffering? Is it worth betraying those you're supposed to be loyal to? And the answer the story gives is, maybe. It doesn't moralize in the way the church would. It just shows you the beauty and the pain, and lets you decide. Imagine a scene from the story. Tristan and Isolde are meeting in a garden at dusk, the sky fading from blue to violet. The air smells of roses, and somewhere nearby, a nightingale is singing. They're holding hands, and neither of them speaks because there's nothing left to say. They know this is dangerous, that they'll be discovered eventually, that their love is leading them both toward ruin. But at this moment, none of that matters. There's only the warmth of each other's hands, the soft rustle of leaves, the feeling that, just for now, they're exactly where they're supposed to be. And here's a final food detail to carry with you. In the late Middle Ages, nobles sometimes served a dish called hippocras, a spiced wine sweetened with honey and flavored with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. It was usually served at the end of a feast, a warm, soothing drink that helped with digestion and left a sweet, lingering taste. Imagine Tristan and Isolde sharing a cup of hippocras on a cold evening, passing it back and forth, their fingers brushing. It's the kind of small, intimate gesture that says more than any grand declaration. By the 15th century, courtly love as a living tradition was mostly gone. The social structures that supported it, the feudal courts, the culture of chivalry, were breaking down. The Renaissance was beginning, bringing new ideas about love, art, and individuality. And yet, the stories remained. People still read about Lancelot and Guinevere, about Tristan and Isolde, about Abelard and Heloise. These stories became part of the cultural DNA of Europe, shaping how people thought about love for centuries to come. And in a way, they're still with us. Every romance novel, every love song, every movie about star-crossed lovers, they all owe something to the medieval tradition of courtly love. The idea that love should be passionate, that it's worth fighting for, that it can be both beautiful and destructive, all of that comes from those long-ago courts and castles, where knights wrote poems and ladies held secret meetings in gardens, and everyone knew that love was dangerous, but that didn't make it any less worth pursuing. Let me leave you with one last image. It's twilight in a castle garden, somewhere in France, in the year 1400. A lady stands alone by a fountain, wrapped in a cloak against the evening chill. She's holding a letter, reading it one last time before she folds it carefully and tucks it into her sleeve. The letter is from a knight who's gone on crusade, and she doesn't know if she'll ever see him again. But she has his words, and for now, that's enough. The garden is quiet. The roses are fading, their petals drifting to the ground. A single candle burns in a window of the castle, a small light against the gathering dark. And in that stillness, there's a kind of peace, not the peace of resolution, but the peace of acceptance. Love is complicated. It always has been. And sometimes, the best we can do is hold on to the moments of beauty, the stolen kisses and secret letters, the taste of Hippocras on a cold night, and let them sustain us through the long, uncertain hours. Let your breathing slow now, slow and deep and steady. Let your body relax completely, every muscle soft and loose. Let the story fade into the background, like the murmur of voices in another room, comforting but distant. Let yourself drift into sleep, carried on the memory of gardens and castles, of knights and ladies, of love that was impossible and yet somehow, in the telling, became eternal. Sleep well, dear friend. Dream of distant times and quiet courtyards, of candles flickering in stone halls, of love whispered in the shadows. And know that somewhere in the long, winding story of human longing, your own heart's desires are held, understood, and honored. If you peacefully drifted off tonight, or if this journey brought you even a moment of calm, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. What story from the Middle Ages speaks to you? What detail caught your imagination? Let me know, but only if you're still awake. And if you're listening to this again, or if you found your way here for the first time, thank you. Thank you for trusting me with this quiet hour, for letting me walk with you through history, through the gentle shadows of the past. From all of us here at Boring History for Sleep, sweet dreams. Close your eyes, rest deeply, and let the world of courtly love carry you softly, softly into the night. Good night.